Welcome to the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. Today we'll be looking at a crucial part of the capacity building and development process, setting objectives. It's actually the second step in the whole process and super important for making sure your capacity building initiatives are effective. Before we dive into the nitty-gritty of how to actually set objectives, can you give us a bit of a bigger picture view? Where does police capacity building fit within international security efforts in general?
Police capacity building is actually a really important part of what we call security sector reform, or SSR. And this is something that's highlighted in UN Security Council Resolution 2151. Basically, it emphasizes that if you want to achieve peace and stability in a country, you need to make sure that you reform and strengthen the entire security sector.
So it's not just about the police force specifically, it's about the whole security landscape.
Exactly. It's about looking at all the different elements. So the police, of course, but also the military, the justice system, even civil society organizations. It's about making sure all of these different pieces work together smoothly and effectively. And police capacity building focuses specifically on how we can help the police force perform their duties professionally and contribute to that bigger goal of a secure and stable society.
And this connects to sort of real-world goals as well, right? Like the UN's Sustainable Development Goals.
Absolutely. Goal 16 is all about peace, justice, and strong institutions. And there are some targets within Goal 16 that are really directly relevant to police capacity building. Reducing violence and promoting the rule of law and making sure everyone has access to justice. These targets give us concrete benchmarks, so we can actually measure how successful our efforts are.
So we've got these big global frameworks and goals, but what about the more practical stuff? What are the specific documents that actually guide how we set objectives in police capacity building?
Okay, so there are three really crucial documents. First, you have the mission mandate, and this sets out the overall objectives and scope of whatever mission you're working on. Second, you have the host state capacity building framework. And this might be something like a police development plan. Basically, it lays out how the host country wants to see their police force reformed. And then third, you have the national security framework. And that gives you the broader context for all the security activities happening in that country. And it's really essential that the objectives for police capacity building are lined up with all three of these documents. That's how you ensure that everyone's working together in a unified and effective way.
Makes sense. You got to make sure everyone's pulling in the same direction, from the international mission all the way down to the national level. But you mentioned aligning with other actors as well. Who else do we need to be thinking about?
So it's not just about those documents. You also need to think about the objectives and activities of other security sector actors. This includes both governmental and non-governmental organizations. So for example, let's say we're working on improving community policing. Well, we need to make sure that our efforts are complementing what NGOs are doing, NGOs that focus on community engagement or human rights.
Yeah, and that brings up another really important point. Resources are often limited, right? Especially in international context. So how do we decide what to prioritize? There's so many needs. How do we decide what capacity building activities to focus on?
That's the million-dollar question. Prioritization is always a challenge in this field. We need to have a really clear process for making decisions about where to focus our efforts, and it needs to be a process that's transparent and accountable and that we can use over and over again. One approach is to look at a few factors. So first, how important is this activity to the people we're trying to help? Then how well does it align with our strategic goals? And does it work well with other initiatives that are already happening? And of course, a really big question is it actually doable? Can we really pull it off, given the resources we have?
Sounds like there's a lot to juggle. Trying to balance all those factors and make sure that we're using those limited resources as effectively as possible.
Yeah, it definitely is. It's a constant process of assessment. And things are always changing, so we need to be flexible and adapt our priorities as we go along.
We've talked about alignment and coordination and prioritization. But let's not forget about sustainability. How do we make sure that the things we do actually have a lasting impact?
That's where the idea of local ownership comes in. This is super important if you want to see sustainable results. It basically means that the host country is in the driver's seat. They're the ones leading the police reform process. And that way you can be sure that the changes we're supporting are in line with their own political objectives and that there's genuine commitment from their institutions.
So it's about empowering them to sort of take control of their own future, not just imposing solutions from the outside.
Exactly. We're there to help and support, not to tell them what to do. But achieving this level of local ownership It can be tricky. It requires us to build strong relationships and to, cultivate trust and to be really sensitive to the local context. So this might involve things like getting our counterparts involved in every step of the process from the very beginning when we're assessing needs all the way through to implementation. And it also means making sure their priorities are reflected in our plans and just having a continuous dialogue and making sure everyone's on the same page.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that police reform can be a sensitive area. I mean, you're potentially shifting power dynamics. You're challenging existing structures. So we need to be respectful and diplomatic in how we approach this.
Absolutely. Building trust and understanding is essential. Our role is to facilitate and support, not to dictate. Ultimately, we want to empower the host country to achieve their own vision for police reform.
That's a great overview of the broader context. But how do we actually translate these principles into action? What are the key principles or frameworks for setting effective objectives?
So one of the most widely used frameworks is the SMART framework. It's a really simple but powerful tool to make sure that our objectives are well-defined and achievable.
I've heard of SMART goals before, but I'm not sure I could actually explain it. Could you give us a quick rundown?
Sure. So SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-bound.
Okay, great. Let's break it down a bit. Starting with specific, what does that mean when we're talking about setting objectives?
So a specific objective clearly defines what we're trying to accomplish. It avoids vague language and instead uses concrete details about the desired outcome. For example, instead of saying we want to improve police training, a specific objective would be something like increase the number of police officers training community policing techniques by 25% within the next year.
Right, okay. So the more specific we are, the easier it is to actually come up with a plan and track our progress and see if we're actually succeeding.
Specificity is crucial when you're setting objectives. Okay, now let's move on to measurable.
Measurable. So what makes an objective measurable?
A measurable objective includes a way to track progress and determine if we've achieved it. This usually involves identifying what we call key performance indicators or KPIs that we can monitor. For instance, if our objective is to reduce response times to emergency calls, we might look at the average time it takes for police to arrive on scene. That would be our KPI, and it gives us a concrete way to measure whether we're making progress.
Got it. So we can actually see if our efforts are leading to real improvements on the ground. Measurable objectives help keep us accountable and on track. What about achievable? What does that mean?
Well, an achievable objective has to be realistic. We have to be able to actually achieve it given the resources we have, the time frames, and the local context. So it's good to be ambitious, but we also need to keep our feet on the ground.
Makes sense. No point in setting ourselves up for failure by aiming for something that's impossible.
Right. It's all about finding the right balance between ambition and pragmatism.
Okay, so achievable is about finding that sweet spot. So next up we have relevant. What does it mean for an objective to be relevant in this context?
A relevant objective has to align with the overall goals of the mission and the host country's priorities as well. And of course, the broader security context. It's about making sure our efforts are actually contributing to the big picture, not getting sidetracked by less important issues.
Staying focused on what really matters. And lastly, we have time-bound. What does that involve?
A time-bound objective has a clear deadline or time frame for completion. This helps to create a sense of urgency and keep us on schedule.
So instead of saying improve police-community relations, we'd say something like establish regular community meetings in all districts by the end of the next quarter.
Having that deadline helps focus our efforts and ensures that we're making real progress towards our objectives. So that's the SMART framework in a nutshell. And it's really helpful for setting objectives that are well-defined and that will actually contribute to the success of our capacity building efforts.
Yeah, this SMART framework is really useful. But I want to circle back to the idea of local ownership for a second. How does that factor into the process of setting objectives?
That's a really important point. We can't just apply the SMART framework in a vacuum. We need to remember that these objectives should be developed collaboratively, not imposed on the host country. They need to reflect the host country's needs and priorities. That means we need to involve our counterparts every step of the way and make sure they feel like they have ownership over these objectives.
So it's about combining this SMART framework with that sensitivity to local ownership, making sure our efforts are in line with the host country's vision for police reform.
Absolutely. It's about working together to create a shared vision for success. And that kind of collaborative approach is essential for achieving results that are sustainable and impactful. Results that will actually make a difference in the long run. So now we've got a good grasp on setting SMART objectives and the importance of local ownership. Let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another crucial element in capacity building and development, and that's a performance framework.
Okay, performance framework. That sounds kind of interesting. What is it exactly? And why is it so important in this context?
Well, you can think of the performance framework like a roadmap. It basically guides us towards achieving our objectives. It gives us this structured way to track our progress and measure how effective our efforts are. And, make informed decisions as we go along. Without a performance framework, you're kind of operating in the dark. You can't really tell if you're making a real difference or not.
So it's about bringing in some accountability and measurability to our work. How do we actually go about setting up a good performance framework? What are the key things we need to think about?
So the core of any performance framework is choosing the right performance indicators, often called PIs, or sometimes key performance indicators, KPIs. Those are for the really crucial aspects of performance. These indicators give us some concrete metrics so we can actually quantify the progress we're making towards our objectives.
Can you give us some examples of what these PIs or KPIs might look like in a police capacity building project? What sort of things would we be measuring?
Sure. So let's say one of our objectives is to improve the host state police's investigative capacity, right? So a relevant KPI in that case might be the percentage of criminal cases that are successfully investigated and prosecuted. That would give us a measurable way to see if the training and mentoring we're providing is actually leading to improvements in how well the police force can solve crimes.
Okay, I see. We need to be able to tell if our efforts are making a real difference on the ground. Are there any guidelines or resources that can help us figure out what the right performance indicators are? I imagine that can be pretty tricky.
Yeah, definitely. You don't have to start from scratch. Annex 2 of the Capacity Building and Development Guidelines, that's part of the UN's Strategic Guidance Framework for International Police Peacekeeping. That actually has a whole bunch of relevant performance indicators. So that's a really good place to start if you're looking for some guidance.
Great. That's good to know. So as we're developing these PIs and KPIs, are there any important principles we should keep in mind to make sure they're actually effective and useful?
Yeah, there are a few things that are really important. So first, the PIs and KPIs need to be meaningful. They need to directly reflect the objective they're measuring. We want to make sure they're capturing what's actually important. Then they have to be ascertainable, which basically means we can actually collect the data to track them. I mean, there's no point in having an indicator if you can't even measure it. Then they should be manageable, not too complex or burdensome to keep track of. Keep it simple. And probably most important, they should be countable, which means we can express them numerically. That makes it much easier to compare and evaluate progress over time.
I'm curious about that last point. Why is it so important for them to be quantifiable? What's the advantage of that?
Well, it's all about objectivity and clarity. Numbers give you a level of precision that you just don't get with qualitative descriptions. So when you take qualitative data like observations or anecdotal feedback and you turn it into quantitative data, you create these benchmarks that are much more objective. They're less open to interpretation.
Right. So instead of saying police community relations have improved, which is pretty vague, you might track the number of community meetings held or the number of citizen complaints. Things like that.
Exactly. Those quantifiable indicators paint a much clearer picture of what's actually happening and help us assess the impact of our work in a more objective and rigorous way.
This is really interesting. I'm starting to understand how important a well-designed performance framework is if you want to evaluate how effective your capacity building work is. Can you give us a quick recap of the main takeaways? Just highlight the most important things we've talked about.
Okay, sure. So the big takeaway is that a solid performance framework is absolutely essential if you want to evaluate how well your capacity building and development initiatives are working. It lets us move beyond guesswork and make decisions that are based on data. And this framework relies on those well-defined performance indicators, the PIs and KPIs. And those indicators should be meaningful and ascertainable and manageable and, most importantly, countable. And by transforming our qualitative observations into quantifiable metrics, we can track progress objectively and measure our impact and make sure that our efforts are producing real, tangible results.
Okay, so that's a great overview of how to set up a performance framework. But setting objectives and measuring progress is only one part of the process.
Yeah.
What are the next steps? How do we actually put our plans into action and make a difference on the ground?
So we've got our objectives all set. We have our performance framework in place. Now we move on to the next phase of capacity building and development, which is developing a good action plan. Basically, this plan lays out all the steps and activities and resources that we need to actually achieve our objectives. It's like the operational blueprint for our capacity building work.
So this is where we move from the big picture ideas to the practical stuff. What are the key elements of a good action plan? What should we be focusing on when we're putting it together?
Okay, so a solid action plan usually has a few key components. First, we need to take each objective and break it down into smaller, more manageable tasks. This makes things much clearer and makes it easier to actually implement the plan. Then we set timelines for each activity. This helps keep us on track and ensures that we're making steady progress toward our goals. And of course, we need to identify what resources we need for each activity. That could be human resources, financial resources, equipment, any other kind of support. We got to make sure we have what we need. Then we assign responsibility for each activity. This way, everyone knows who's accountable, and we can make sure everyone's working together effectively. And lastly, we need to establish some kind of mechanism for monitoring and evaluation. This lets us track our progress, identify any challenges or roadblocks that come up, and make adjustments as needed.
It sounds like a pretty thorough process. I imagine there's some common mistakes people make at this stage. What are some things we should be careful about as we're developing our action plan?
You're right. There are definitely some traps we need to avoid. One of the big ones is not involving our counterparts enough in the planning process. Remember, we talked about how important local ownership is for sustainability. So we really want to make sure that the action plan reflects the host country's priorities and that they really feel like they own the process. Another common mistake is creating a plan that's just too complicated or too ambitious. You know something that's not realistic given the resources and time we have. It's got to be a balance between being ambitious and being practical. And finally, we need to avoid making a plan that's too rigid, like set in stone. Things can change quickly on the ground, so we need to be flexible and adaptable and willing to make changes as we go along.
Yeah, that's a good point. Flexibility is key in these situations. We've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about key steps in capacity building and development, setting objectives, establishing a performance framework, and developing an action plan. As we wrap up, is there any final piece of advice you'd like to give our listeners who are working in this field in international policing?
I think the most important thing is to always remember that collaboration and partnership are essential. Capacity building is not about coming in and imposing solutions from the outside. It's about working side by side with our host state counterparts, helping them to develop their capacity, empowering them to take ownership of the process. Sustainable change has to come from within. If we work together with respect and in a spirit of collaboration, we can make a real difference. We can help build stronger, more effective police institutions all over the world.
That's great advice. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. This has been a really helpful overview of objective setting in capacity building and development. I hope our listeners found it valuable.
My pleasure.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on the International Policing Podcast on capacity building and development. We'll see you next time.